So this is John 13, 21 to 26, and this is from the New International Version. After he had said this, Jesus was troubled in spirit and testified, "Very truly, I tell you, one of you is going to betray me." His disciples stared at one another, at a loss to know which of them he meant. One of them, the disciple who Jesus loved, was reclining next to him. Simon Peter motioned to this disciple and said, "Ask him which one he means." Leaning back against Jesus, he asked him, "Lord, who is it?" Jesus answered, "It is the one to whom I will give this piece of bread when I have dipped it in the dish."
Thanks, Nick. Give it to her. Hi, good morning, everyone. Good morning to those online. Thanks to Barbara for her feedback about the sound. It's nice to be encouraged. So I'm continuing in our series this morning, our series about biblical characters. And I want to talk about this guy who you will all instantly recognise as John when Jonathan puts it up. Yeah, instantly recognisable. Now, whoever chose the order of books when they go into our Bible, they didn't do John any favours, did they? I mean, you know the rhyme. Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, Acts and Romans follow on. Well, you wouldn't want your life's work being sandwiched in between Luke's magnificent Gospels, his Gospel and the book of Acts. I know how he feels because I've had to follow on from Anne and Alice and Arn's next week and Dawn's the week after, and it's great to see Dawn's not plastered anymore. I can keep up with you with puns, Ski. I really can. But I chose John because through all four Gospels, you can see him grow as a person. You can see from when he first becomes a Christian all the way through to his role as a church elder. And when I've been looking into it, if you read about John in later life, there's the stuff that's not really in the Bible, but his life in Patmos afterwards. I was reminded, you ever see that 70s sitcom, Are You Being Served? Where they used to roll out young Mr. Grace, and he used to come out through the elevator doors and say, "You've all done really well." Well, apparently that used to happen to John. He used to roll him out into the worship service, and he would go, "Love one another," and then he'd roll back in again. So but it just struck me as being very bizarre. But of course, Jesus tells us to love one another. Now, I've got quite a few Bible passages this morning. Jonathan's going to put them up on the screen. But also, if I've got my role as tech guy right, they will be on our Facebook page in about 4.5 minutes, because it's going on at 11:15, according to Facebook Meta. But I've thought about John a lot, and I like journeys. I like watching the programs on journeys. I watch all the travel logs. Michael Palin's Around the World in 80 Days is one of my favourites. And this book is one of my go-to books. It's my comfort book. When I can't sleep at 3 o'clock in the morning, this is the book I turn to. It's by Libby Purvis, who's a radio journalist, and her husband, Paul Heine. You probably know Paul more from Esther Ranson's programme, That's Life. Well, this book is their story of one summer that they took out. And they sailed around Britain in a little boat called Grace O'Malley with their 2 young children. And it's just a wonderful, it gives you a warm feeling. And I remember somebody told me once that we're all on a journey. And I have to quote Arnott, because he used in one of his sermons once, that we're all on a spiritual journey, whether we know it or not. Well, we first meet John in Matthew 4, verse 21. He and his brother James, they were with their dad Zebedee, fixing and preparing their fishing nets. Jesus called to them, and straight away they dropped everything and went with Jesus. Now, we don't know if James and John had met Jesus before. There is some stories that they were part of the posse that John the Baptist sent to see Jesus, to say, "Are you the one that we've been waiting for?" But it must be wonderful just to be able to drop everything and follow your calling. Just like Abraham in the Old Testament, John embarks on this journey. He doesn't know where he's going. He doesn't know the end result. And he definitely doesn't know what he's going to have to go through before he gets there. Duncan and Alison will understand this, but being self-employed, I have to wonder what Zebedee would have thought about losing 2/3 of his workforce all in one go. I'm sure he bounced back, but quality humour. You don't get that from Bridges next week. Well, I wonder if God's calling you. And if he has, how did you respond? How are you responding? Did you drop everything like James and John? Are you trying to meet him halfway? Are you trying to do it your way and doing God's will around the edges, as it were? Maybe you've done your bit and it's time for you to retire. One of the podcasts I've been listening to this week came out with this wonderful line: if you're still breathing, God's still calling. A few years ago, I did a Call to Serve course with the University of Cumbria, and we had to study a book by Francis Dewar. It's called Called or Collared. And what he said has always stuck with me. Francis said this: our notion of calling or vocation has become very narrow, and it's often taken to only mean the calling to be an ordained minister. I want to rescue the idea from all those assumptions, because I believe that God calls every human being in some self-giving task at every stage of their life. I can remember when I was first called. I was at Keswick Convention. It was in 2012. And I ended up at the front of the stage. Those of you that know me, that this is all bluster really. I'm really quite a shy person. And I don't know how I got to the front of an auditorium that held about 2,000 people. But I ended up there. And it was one of those God instances. Because I came face to face with a guy called Jeff Ernie. And we talked about what my calling might be at that particular time. And he straight away said prayer. It was very weird. The other thing about the God instance is that at the time, Jeff was a vicar in Keswick, and he was retiring the week after. And his retirement home was in Leyland. So, I mean, most people retire the other way around, don't they? They go from Leyland to Keswick. Jeff did it the other way around, and there must have been 20 people welcoming people that were answering the call. And so there was like a 1 in 20 chance of me getting Jeff. But I did. A wonderful guy. He's been a big influence on my life. But I've never lost that sense of call in my life. I've sometimes compromised it. I've sometimes tried to walk away from it. I've given into temptation. But I've never completely lost sight of it. Or maybe I should say, I've never really lost sight of him. Maybe we shouldn't be surprised when we try to do it our own way that our Christian journey doesn't go as smoothly as we'd hope. One of the things I found encouraging about this series is that the guys we've been talking about aren't superhuman. Apart from, of course, Duncan's ministry, where he always chooses the easiest and obvious one. He chose Jesus, didn't he? He was definitely superhuman. But the rest of us have gone for more of a challenge. In Luke 9, I'm going to get killed tonight at leaders' meeting. Okay, you can guess who's going to get all the grotty jobs for the next fortnight, can't you? In Luke 9, we find John and his brother James proving that even those who spend 24/7 with Jesus, even they can still get it wrong. If you remember, Jesus had decided his time had come, and he was about to make his way to Jerusalem to fulfill what the scriptures had written about him. At this point, I should say that all these Bible scriptures and things like that, if you're not familiar with the Bible, please come and talk to myself or Duncan, Alison, or any of the leadership team, Mark. We'd love to help you. For those of you watching online, you can email us. If you send us a private message on Facebook, then either myself or Dawn will answer. Or you can email me at davelegg@unionroadcc.co.uk. So Jesus was heading towards that first Easter. Unfortunately, Google Maps had decided that there was a Samaritan village in the way, and they weren't too happy about Jesus and his friends rocking up and spending the night there. So they refused them entry. Now, to say that our favourite brothers were none too impressed by this is a big understatement. They wanted God to pour down fire from heaven on this village. They want to nuke it. It's no wonder Jesus nicknamed the sons of thunder. Imagine their surprise then when it was them two that got the telling off by Jesus, not the villagers. You see, the Thunder Brothers had been with Jesus when he preached on the mountainside, when Jesus preached about forgiveness. In other words, having a manner that is completely opposite of that displayed by John and James. Whereas the John we met at the lakeside was full of joy and enthusiasm at the beginning of his discipleship, the John we see here shows that someone recently converted within 2 years. Someone recently converted to Christianity can sometimes behave the complete opposite of a saint. Indeed, some of us that have been a Christian for a lot longer can sometimes show characteristics of someone definitely not a saint. We are sure at that point that our way is the right way, the only way, that we want to impose those views on others. I think we've seen this in the news over the last couple of weeks. But that isn't the way to spread a gospel message of love and forgiveness. There's another passage in Mark's Gospel where the Thunder Brothers asked that they be seated on either side of Jesus when he returns in glory. Again, showing that they didn't have a clue of where they were heading or what they were going to have to go through to get there. Before we judge these guys too harshly, though, don't we always want to sit in the best seats? When Jeff and Simon go to Rovers, they don't want to sit on their own at the corner flag. They want to sit where they can get the best view of the action, where they can see the goals when they happen, the near misses, and even the penalty saves. Sorry, Sam, I couldn't resist that one. He was at the Newcastle, and you probably didn't see it. Yes, there was an element of sitting in places of honour, right next to the main man. But surely they knew by then that Jesus wouldn't be ruling at arm's length. This was the guy that was born in a stable. This is the guy who ate with tax collectors and prostitutes. This is the guy who got in the river with John the Baptist. This is the guy who healed lepers by touching them. In Mark chapter 10, verse 45, Jesus tells them they had come to serve, not to be served. Jesus was and is a hands-on king. Wouldn't you want to be as close to him as possible? I would, and I do. So I know where the guys are coming from. But we shouldn't forget also Jesus' advice about not sitting in the best place at parties. What they didn't know was that they, along with Peter, would be the first to see Jesus in all his glory. We find the passage about Jesus' mountaintop meeting with Moses and Elijah in Luke 9. Luke tells us that Jesus' face changed. His clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. This really is the first time that the disciples actually see Jesus for who he actually is, fully God and fully human. The church name for this passage is the Transfiguration. This just means that he was transformed from his human likeness to how he is when he's in heaven. The more I've read this passage, I've seen it from a different light this week. The more I've read it, the more I've been aware that although his appearance had changed, in his discussions with Moses and Elijah, he really is showing his human side. It's a really difficult concept to understand, but Jesus was truly fully God and fully human. The Bible tells us they were talking about what was to come when Jesus got to Jerusalem and what he had to go through that first Easter week. Maybe this was the human side of Jesus, seeking reassurance that this was the right path. And just as he did in the garden on Maundy Thursday, making sure he was doing the right thing at the right time. In verse 36, God tells Peter, James and John, this is my son. Listen to him. I think that's good advice for us all. This morning, as part of our communion service, we've been reminding ourselves of the events in that upper room during the night that Jesus was betrayed. The passage that Nicola read is from that night. And it's John 13, verses 21 to 26. Now, most of the Bible experts agree that the phrase, the disciple whom Jesus loved, refers to John. And they say that the relationship between the two of them is like a father-son relationship. The disciples had turned up expecting just another Passover meal. They'd done it year in, year out. But as John 13 tells us, the room suddenly became really heavy with sadness. Jesus is clearly troubled. Again, maybe this is the first time they've seen Jesus showing this emotion. But the atmosphere gets even worse when Jesus tells them that within the next few hours, one of them is going to betray him. Peter asks John to find out who it is because John's the one sitting closest to him. There's only really John that could ask him that question. The original Greek text says that John leaned back on the chest of Jesus and said, "Who is it?" And it seems that the answer was for John's ears alone. One commentator noted that by leaning back onto Jesus' chest, John would have been able to feel the very heartbeat of God. Sometimes I wonder if I'm close enough to hear him speak. Sometimes I wonder if I'm close enough to hear God yell at me, let alone hear his heartbeat. But that's my fault. I'm the one who's moved. Despite Peter's protests, it's John who we find the following day at the foot of the cross. All the other disciples had flown. Those of us that were at the full picture on Tuesday night heard Arnott describe the church as God's movement. Well, God's movement, which began with Adam and Eve and through Abraham grew into a nation of many thousands, was down to just 5 people stood at the foot of the cross. And Charlotte would like me to point out that John was the only bloke there. But because John's there, he's able to perform one more duty for his Lord and Saviour. He accepts Mary as his mother. This is no small undertaking. John was committing to support and care for Mary for the rest of her life. Even hung on a cross, at the point of death, even in a form of crucifixion that the Romans later did away with because they said it was too cruel. Even then, Jesus is still caring for those he loved. So what can we learn from John? Well, what I've taken is that it's okay to make mistakes, to misunderstand the Christian message. That there's a difference between believing in God and being a disciple. I think there's even a difference between being a converted person and being a disciple. That whatever your personality, you might be as quiet as Marion or Nancy, or you might be as loud or as thunderous as myself and Arnott. But there's a place for you in God's church, God's movement. Life's difficult and there are dark times as a follower of Jesus, as John found out. A couple of months ago, you guys were all walking around with your Christmas jumpers on. And no doubt some of you had posters up saying, Jesus is the reason for the season. And you're right. But Easter Sunday is the reason that Jesus is the reason for the season. And you can't have Easter Sunday without Maundy Thursday or Good Friday. Mark Kermode and Simon Mayo had a film review program a few years ago. And they had a phrase, it will be okay in the end. And if it's not okay, it's not the end. I thought of that when I heard the actor Samantha Morton doing her acceptance speech at the BAFTAs. If you don't know what she's been through, please look it up. Again, there'll be a link on our Facebook page at 12 o'clock showing her interview with Woman's Hour, where she talks about her faith and where she's come from. She was adopted as a child. She went through the foster system. But her faith kept her going. Her faith got her through it. As she said, it wasn't all right, but it is now. Through the highest of highs, that first calling of John at the fishing boats and the transfiguration, the feeding of the 5,000, and of course, Easter Sunday and the resurrection. To the lowest of lows, the Last Supper, praying in the garden, witnessing the death on the cross. John was there. Yes, and as we've seen, he messed up a few times, but he stayed the course and stuck to his calling. Can we say the same? In our lives, it might be a dark time. It might be a Friday in our lives at the time, but Sunday's coming. Amen. Thanks, Guy. Thanks.
Thank you, David. It's always good and reassured to know that even as Christians, when we should know better and we make mistakes and we mess up, you know, the Lord does forgive us. We sort of brush ourselves down, get ourselves right, and move on. You know, we're not saved by works, or we'd never get there. We're saved by grace. I'm really thankful for that. And thanks for bringing that message home as well. Really appreciate it. Thank you, David. Okay, we're going to